Hey everybody, this is my Module 7 discussion video over chapters 12 and 13. So both chapters gave us a small walk through a section of United States history. Being a history geek, I found both chapters to be very interesting, and I found a different perspective to how women's rights and minorities' rights were held back with many Supreme Court cases outlined in the chapters. I thought both chapters did a great job at covering the many aspects and progressions of how both groups gained their rights that they have today. Also, the chapter just gives us a look into a part of U.S. history that is not as innocent as some believe. Chapter 12 has a sole focus on how women have been viewed in American history and shows the progression of how they obtained the rights they have now. Pages 342 to 344 show a brief overview of how different eras and areas of the world viewed women. None of these views being the view that we have today of women, as most of history shows women being subordinate, controlled by men, and viewed as property. It always amazes me to read and try to comprehend how a different era of our country responded different to different issues, and they had such different opinions than what our modern day has. This is not only with respect to women, but with other issues that we have going on. The chapter also gives us insight to the path of women's suffrage. In my undergrad schooling, I took a class that focused largely on the history and adversities that women's right advocates were confronted with when trying to secure the right to vote and to gain equal respect as their men counterparts. The class really opened my eyes up and showed me that what is taught during our time in middle school and high school barely touches on these types of issues. I think the chapter does a great job at showing the overview of many struggles people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony endured to fight for things that should already be a natural given right for women. The issue highlighted box in chapter 12 provided new information that I was not aware of. I was not aware of the two movements that it was discussing. I guess I was just oblivious to the amount of sexual and gender harassment in the workplace. It is distasteful to read about the percentages of these types of harassments that occur in our everyday workplaces. I wish the issues highlighted box would have provided more information on why these types of harassments are higher in law firms. I thought that was very interesting. But overall, I do hope that the movements continue their campaign and are able to eventually reduce the amount of gender and sexual harassment in our country's workplace. I want to jump into chapter 13 and discuss the variety of topics it covers as it begins with African American slavery. I feel like the history books I learned from in grade school provided much more detail in the history of slavery than it did in other topics that are covered in both chapters 12 and 13. This is not to say that slavery is not worthy of being learned about in detail and understood, but I think all issues that we are discussing in chapter 12 and 13 should be discussed in detail just as much as slavery is, because they are all important. I feel like every time I read a chapter or material over slavery that I learn something new. I found it extremely interesting to learn about Anthony Johnson and the case of Johnson v. Parker. I wish I could talk about the whole chapter in detail, because I thought the whole chapter 13 was very, very interesting. But another aspect that chapter 13 uncovers is the sheer amount of Supreme Court cases that ruled totally or mostly against black people and their rights before and after slavery. For an example, the case in there that was discussed, one of the cases was Williams versus the state of Mississippi in 1898. It ruled that literacy tests used to exclude black people from juries and voting were still constitutional, because it says it also limits white people that were not able to take the tests. But I think these types of devices were created by white people These types of devices were created by white people who would go out of their way to find methods of denying black people their rights to vote, and it's blatantly obvious that that's why these literacy tests and other devices were formed. I believe that specifically with this case, that even superior political individuals supported ideas like disenfranchisement, but had to find loopholes and lags in the system to support their rulings. The last thing I'd like to discuss is the chapter's issue highlighted box, which provides another controversial question. The box speaks about sanctuary cities and if cities like this should be denied federal funding. This poses a tough question, as one must look at the Constitution. One must look at how the Constitution separates what powers the federal and state governments possess. I personally believe that funding should be denied to these types of cities, as they're allowing undocumented people into the country without legal consequences. I don't want to go into the specifics of the negative consequences that this could have in our country. However, I do understand that the 10th Amendment does allow state governments to enact their own specific policies on issues that are not regulated by the federal government, this being one. When I was reading about this issue highlighted box with the sanctuary cities, I thought of an issue that was analogous to the one that we're talking about. This issue would be the legalization of marijuana in some states. Of course, we know some states have legalized it and some states have not. Federal government and law does not recognize marijuana as being a legal substance, but has no voice on if states can or cannot legalize it. However, though state law enforcement may not reprimand anyone for recreational marijuana use in the state that it's legal, federal law enforcement still can. This causes these types of issues to be many layers deep and complex to evaluate. I use that example to say this. Though the federal law has strict guidelines on how to deal with undocumented people in the United States, individual states do not have to adopt these guidelines. It takes one to aid the other. If the states aren't going to aid the federal government in doing this, the federal government does not really have the power to reprimand them for not doing so. So states do have the power to regulate on this issue in the manner that they please. And if the federal government reprimanded them for doing so, it would actually turn out to be a possible violation of the 10th Amendment. So that is it for my last discussion over chapters 12 and 13. Hope you all enjoyed it. I hope everybody's staying safe. And I look forward to reading some of y'all's discussions. Thank you.